We're going to read from Matthew chapter 1. Matthew 1, starting in verse 1. It says, "The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren. And Judas begat Phares and Zerah of Thamar. And Phares begat Esrom, and Esrom begat Amram. And Amram begat Amminadab, and Amminadab begat Naasson. And Naasson begat Salmon, and Salmon begat Boaz of Rechab. And Boaz begat Obed of Ruth. And Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David the king. And David the king begat Solomon, of her that had been the wife of Urias. And Solomon begat Rehoboam, and Rehoboam begat Abiah, and Abiah begat Asa, and Asa begat Joshaphat, and Joshaphat begat Joram, and Joram begat Ozias, and Ozias begat Joatham, and Joatham begat Achaz, and Achaz begat Ezekias, and Ezekias begat Manasseh, and Manasseh begat Amon, and Amon begat Josias, and Josias begat Jeconias and his brethren about the time they were carried away to Babylon. And after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconias begat Salathiel, and Salathiel begat Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel begat Abiud, and Abiud begat Eliakim, and Eliakim begat Azar, and Azar begat Sadak, and Sadak begat Achim, and Achim begat Eliud, and Eliud begat Eleazar, and Eleazar begat Mathan, and Mathan begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations, and from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations." And I'll stop reading there. So, to open up the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, the Lord gives us the genealogy of Joseph's line, who's the husband of Mary. And we're told in verse 1, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And we know this helps us to understand that in the Bible, when we read that someone's a son of someone else, it's not always an immediate father-son relationship, because Jesus was not the immediate son of David or the immediate son of Abraham. He was born by the Holy Spirit to his mother Mary and Joseph in the first century, and David lived about 1,000 years earlier. And Abraham lived 2,000 years before that, and yet Jesus is called the son of both Abraham and David. And that helps us understanding the biblical calendar patriarchs when we look at the book of Genesis and Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, that it's not always an immediate father-son relationship when we read someone's the son of someone else. If the Bible indicates there's an immediate father-son relationship, then that's a different story. But sometimes there isn't, and that was one of the keys to assist us in understanding how God laid out a biblical calendar of history from creation all the way down through the kings. And well, anyway, here in Matthew 1, there's a very interesting genealogy given that is broken up into 3 groups of 14 generations. And we know from verse 17 that God is going from Abraham to David. That would be the first group. And then from David to the carrying away into Babylon, the second group, and from the carrying away into Babylon to Christ, the third group. And we also know that this is not an exact genealogy, that it is not, everyone's not listed. God skips generations. For example, if we read in verse 6 through 8, it says, "And Jesse begat David the king, and David the king begat Solomon, and Solomon was also a king." So the Lord's going to list kings, and that's how we can know that he skipped over some generations. It's David, Solomon. Verse 7, Solomon begat Rehoboam. So far, that's the correct order. Rehoboam begat Abiah, correct. Abiah begat Asa, correct. Asa begat Joshaphat, correct. Joshaphat begat Joram, correct. And Joram begat Ozias. And Ozias is a reference to Uzziah or Azariah. And there, it's true that Joram begat Uzziah, but it's true in the sense that he's a later descendant. Just like Jesus is son of Abraham, son of David, Uzziah is son of Joram. But Joram is not his immediate father. If we go to 2 Chronicles chapter 22, 2 Chronicles 22, we read of a king who came after Joram in verse 1. "And the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah his youngest son king in his stead, for the band of men that came with the Arabians to the camp and slain all the eldest. So Ahaziah the son of Jehoram," and that's Joram, "king of Judah reigned." So Ahaziah is the immediate son of Joram, but he's not listed in Matthew 1. Or go to 2 Chronicles 24, verse 1. Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Zibiah of Beersheba. Joash follows, what's his name? Ahaziah. So Ahaziah, Joash, and then in 2 Chronicles 25, verse 1, Amaziah was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. So you have three kings, Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, that followed Joram, and then go to 2 Chronicles 26, 1, and it says that all the people of Judah took Uzziah, or Ozias, as he's called in Matthew 1. Then the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in the room of his father Amaziah. Which means back in Matthew that in verse 8, where we read that Joshaphat begat Joram and Joram begat Ozias, or Uzziah, God skipped 3 generations of kings. 3, legitimate kings that were reigning on the throne of Judah, and yet the Lord went right from Joram, skipping 3 generations that spanned, I jotted down the number of years, but I forget somewhere. But from Joram, it was decades until Uzziah was made king. And yet in this genealogy, it goes from one man to the next, which tells us something important about the genealogy, that its purpose is not to record an accurate, list of kings or of descendants from Abraham to David, or from David to the carrying away, really is where this is seen, because that's the line of the kings. From David to the carrying away, it's not an accurate list of the kings. And as Mr. Camping used to say, it's a contrived list, meaning that God put these names together, and I'm sure there's even a deep spiritual reason why he omitted those three particular kings. That's why I was looking at the number of years, but I didn't really see anything significant in that gap of years. But I'm sure God had his particular reasons for leaving them out. But one was to kind of tip us off. Okay, don't look at this genealogy as a typical genealogy where you're just given, the history of the lineage of whoever, or in this case of Abraham, and the lineage that leads up to Christ. Don't look at it that way. Well, if we don't look at it that way, how should we look at it? And the answer would be in a spiritual way. And it indicates that there are more than 14 generations from David until the carrying away into Babylon. But God said there's 14 generations from David until the carrying away into Babylon, which means the emphasis is on the number 14. And not only that, but 14 as it's part of the three groups. And we know 14 times 3 is 42. So there's an emphasis on 14 on one hand and on 42 on the other hand. And, we can look at those numbers maybe later if we get a chance. But definitely God is writing this, or moving the writer of Matthew to pen this in such a way that it would highlight a spiritual teaching over the typical laying out of a genealogy. And of course, it's things like this that cause people to say, oh, the Bible has errors. The Bible's full of mistakes. And yet, it's from God's perspective, from the truth that the Lord is conveying, it's completely accurate. In other words, if we come here demanding that this has to be an accurate genealogy listing every generation, then you can make that charge. But God isn't. He didn't say, now here is the full and complete and accurate genealogy of all the descendants. He just said there's 14 generations. From Abraham to David, from David to the carrying away, from the carrying away to Christ. And the number 14, which, I think we would break that number down to 2 times 7, because 7 is the number of perfection, and 2, the number of the of those who identify with the Word of God, or the 2 witnesses, or the caretakers of the Bible. And it's interesting, it starts with Abraham, who we would identify with Israel, and basically Abraham covers unto Christ would cover the whole Old Testament side of the cross. And actually there's more to this that covers the New Testament side of the cross. So really all God's people of Old Testament Israel and the New Testament saints are included in the genealogy of these 42 generations. And that's something we'll try to look at as far as the spiritual meaning a little later. But maybe that's the reason for the breakdown of 2 times 7. Although the number 14 does come up from time to time in the Bible. 14th day of the first month, the Passover, with certain key dates. But I don't see, or I haven't been able to understand where the number 14 has its own particular spiritual meaning. Sometimes numbers that can break down can have their own spiritual meaning, like number 10 could be 2 times 5, but we see 10 means completeness, or 40, 4 times 10, but 40 has its own spiritual meaning. Okay, so one other thing we want to look at is the language of the carrying away into Babylon, or as it says in verse verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations, and from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. Well, in verse 11, there's actually the name of a king given, where it says, and Josias, or Josiah, begat Jeconias and his brethren about the time they were carried away to Babylon. So it's really David to Jeconias. And then the carrying away into Babylon becomes a synonym for Jeconias when it's summed up in verse 17. And Jeconias is one of those last 4 kings of Judah where it gets very complicated and confusing as to who's who because of their names, because of the quick succession in some cases from one king to the other. We know that Jehoaz, well, first let's start with Josiah, good King Josiah. He began to rule in 640 BC at 8 years old, and he reigned 31 years until 609 BC, and 31 plus 8, he was 39 years old, and he got killed in battle with the Egyptians. A man just, flung an arrow, or fling an arrow, you shot an arrow at a venture, and God guided it, and it hit the king of Judah, Josias, and he died. And then that was the end, really, of God's blessing upon Judah. And we can understand that to identify with or tie in with the end of the church age. And Josiah was being blessed of God. He was the one going around removing the high places and the idols. And he was perhaps the greatest king they ever had. And then he died in 609 at the age of 39. 39 breaks down to 3 times 13. And that would tie in with year 1988, the 13,000th year of history, when the church age came to a close. And the blessing of God upon the churches and congregations ceased. The first fruits had been collected. The early rain had fallen. All those to be saved within the church were saved. And then started the Great Tribulation. Well, Jeconias was the third king. There was Jehoaz. He reigned 3 months in year 609 BC. He was the king after Josias. Then there was Jehoiakim, who reigned for 11 years from 609 to 598. And then there was Jehoiachin, also called Jeconiah or Coniah, who the Greek identifies as Jeconias. So Jeconias is Jehoiachin, Jeconiah / Coniah, who we have a little complication with his reign. If we turn to 2 Kings chapter 24, 2 Kings 24, it says in verse 8, Jehoiachin, and this is Jeconias, the man who's listed in Matthew 1, verse 11. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. And his mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. So here we're told he's 18. If we go over to 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 9, it says Jehoiachin was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem, and he did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah. Here we're told he's 8 years old, and in Kings he's 18 years old. And well, as you know, I'm drawing a lot on Mr. Camping's books, the what's that called? The perfect tally of the Hebrew kings, or I can't remember the exact name. But